Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments from the front line in the direction of Avdiivka, where we see that the Russian forces continue their offensive in the north and to the south of the city. The fighting around Avdiivka is focused around the northern parts by the coke plant here to the north of the city. We also see some fighting by the railways west of Krasnoyarivka, where the Russian forces managed to advance yesterday to the south of the coke plant, where they managed to actually contest it, and they are now fighting by and on it. This coke plant oversees all of the fighting here to the south of Avdiivka, the whole city itself, as it is the highest ground of elevation in the area. So there's also heavy fortifications by the Ukrainian forces. And since there is a mining facility here, there's also a lot of tunnels similar to Soledar. However, here they're actually used for military purposes. The city of Avdiivka is the biggest fortress of the Ukrainian forces in the whole war. This is the most fortified area, and the Ukrainian forces have not just built fortifications, they've also built bunkers and tunnels going through the whole area. According to the report by the forces on the ground, the city itself is so fortified that the city of Bakhmut couldn't even compare. It is nothing in comparison. The city of Avdiivka is essentially fighting for every single square meter outside of the city as well as inside of it, as there's fortifications everywhere, there are bunkers everywhere, there are concrete fortifications, there's tunnels and so on all around the area, so the Russians can advance and then the Ukrainians can appear behind them. They can take the area and then be flanked by the Ukrainian forces, and they have to face fortification after fortification as they try to advance in the areas of the villages. However, we're still seeing a major effort by the Russian forces to actually go around and encircle the city. It seems that that is the current plan of the Russian forces, as they're mainly focusing their attacks around the flanks to the north and to the south of the city. We're also seeing direct attacks in the southern parts by the memorial of the defenders of Avdiivka. The Russian objective by fighting here to the south of Avdiivka is to get a foothold in the southern parts. To achieve this, the biggest obstacle is the Ukrainian fortified area here to the west of Avdiivka. This has been the main target of Russian bombardment throughout this day of fighting. We have seen that the Russians have consistently been destroying and blowing up the fortifications here by the west of Avdiivka, as they continuously bombarded with FAB bombs as well as artillery constantly throughout the day of today and yesterday. As for the southwestern part and the northern part, these are both to cut off the supplies and essentially either tactically or physically encircle the city. This is similar to the tactic used in Bakhmut, where the Russian forces, or at that point Wagner forces, decided to go around the city and capture the flanks, after which they managed to reach the final supply line through and in and out of the city, which is the one here in between Ivanivske and Bogdanivka. At the time, the Russian forces were physically cutting off the supply route of the TO504 highway as well as the northern roads. So the only area in and out was this one, and the Russian forces consistently bombarded it, destroying all of the units trying to go between the two sides. And they were shown constant videos of the Ukrainian forces trying to move through and then seeing graveyards of armored vehicles throughout the area. So this same strategy seems to be what the Russian forces are using here by Avdiivka. There's also reported that some of the units fighting here are the Storm Z units. If we take a look at Deep State's map, we see that the Storm Z units are being used here by Vodiane. Those are likely the ones fighting by Severne. As for the northern parts, we see there are DPR units as well as a Russian rifled battalion. So these units are the ones fighting in this section of the front line. We also have multiple Russian battalions and DPR battalions here in the southern parts. So there's a lot of units on the Russian side focused around this part of the front line. And essentially what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces in turn have some marines and infantry within the city. Then we have some mechanized brigades defending the flanks, and we have some infantry brigades within the urban areas. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are opting in for yet another urban fight as they are heavily fortifying the city of Avdiivka, providing further supplies and defending the flanks of the city, trying to extend the supply lines as long as possible. While the Russian forces are now deciding to close the gap and attack the flanks of Avdiivka, trying to repeat this situation by Bakhmut, possibly with the objective being creating a new meat grinder or otherwise trying to take the city itself as the main objective. Now, the only thing we're missing to completely recreate the nostalgia of Bakhmut is a shouting Prigozhin back from the dead to complain about the lack of ammunition. So how the Russians have fought so far in their attempt of taking the flanks of Avdiivka and the continuous offensive here in the direction of Avdiivka is a bunch of armored assaults heavily focused with infantry. So there's been a lot of armored personnel carriers bringing the infantry to the front line, after which they dismount from those armored personnel carriers to then storm the forest lines here to the northern parts, and then they are covered with close air support from helicopters covering from the side, from the air, overviewing the situation, giving them commands, and providing them with cover fire. We can see this from this video here, which was recorded from the Ukrainian side as they were aiming with an ATGM at the Russian positions. We see a field filled with Russian troops, and then the Ukrainians launched this ATGM on their positions. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians have these fortified and prepared positions where they wait for the Russians to then arrive at the front line, and then they shoot down the Russian vehicles and groupings of soldiers, similar to when the Ukrainians were storming the Russian positions in the south. However, we have seen a severe lack of minefields in this part, which could indicate one of two things: either the Ukrainians simply do not have enough to prepare for them, or that they are wanting to draw in the Russian soldiers to then use direct combat to attack them in prepared positions. So that's the amount of heavy fighting we see in the direction of Avdiivka. As for the southern front, the Russians actually counterattacked by the direction of Serevyanki in the direction of Piathatki, where they managed to recapture the forest line here to the west of Lubkove. So this area has been a major target for both sides during the fighting here in this part of the front line, as whoever controls this forest line is able to pressure the opponent and to properly defend their own area, as it is centered in the middle between the two sides. So whoever has control of it has the advantage with the cover of the forest. But again, as I mentioned in my previous video on the Russian-Ukrainian war, the leaves are most likely going to fall soon as we're in the middle of October, which would decrease the worthiness of the forests. We then move on to the northern front, where the Russian forces continue fighting in the direction of Bakhmut, where they have been confirmed by geolocated footage that the Russian forces have stormed Ukrainian positions here to the west of Avdiivka. So here to the southwest of Avdiivka, there's fighting by the Russian forces storming Ukrainian positions in the northern flank of Bakhmut. So the fighting here is continuing like that. As for the northern parts, the Russian forces also managed to advance in the direction of Makiivka, here to the west of Lushenka. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are here expanding their zone of control to the east of the Serebets River, trying to advance in the direction of Makiivka with the recent advance in that direction, and now to the south of it. So most likely they're looking to advance and take control over the eastern bank of the Serebets River. As for the northern parts of the front line, we see fighting in the direction of Kislivka, as well as in the direction of Sinkivka and Liman Pershi, as the Russian forces are pressuring the Ukrainian forces in this area. So we are seeing that the Russian forces are essentially attacking on every part of the front line. There's a gap here between Donetsk and Zaporizhia, but the rest of the front, we're seeing the Russian forces continuously pressuring and attacking Ukrainian positions across the front. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.